All right. Well, it's very nice to be back. Um, I gave a talk a few weeks ago about understanding mobility patterns using large-scale data, and the topic for this talk will be on shared e-scooter services and the role that they can play for sustainable mobility in urban areas. Sorry. If you didn't catch the last talk I gave, just a brief introduction of myself. I'm Erik Jenelius. I'm a professor in public transport systems at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, also head of the division of transport planning here. So I do research and teach in different areas, including urban mobility and micromobility, which I will talk about today. So I will present and summarize a couple of studies we have done in our group. This work has mainly been done together with Boel Berg-Vincent, who is a PhD student focusing on shared e-scooters, my colleague Wilco Burghout, and Hugo Badia Rodriguez, who used to be a postdoc with me and now is a professor at UPC Barcelona. So shared e-scooters, they are a relatively new mode of transport in urban areas. They appeared around 2018, something like that, and has been the reason why we see a very big increase in the number of shared micromobility trips in cities. This graph is from the US and Canada, but we've seen similar trends in other parts of the world as well. And they were kind of introduced by commercial companies. They were not initiated by the cities themselves. So they have led to various controversies, debates, opinions, whether they are a good, positive addition to the urban mobility landscape or not. And they seem to be now a persistent part of the systems. They haven't gone away, and at least in many parts of the world, they are still there. So I think it makes sense to scrutinize and analyze these services from different perspectives. So that's what we have tried to do. And I will go through a couple of different studies covering different aspects of the e-scooter services, starting with a literature review we did, looking at what people have found in terms of use patterns, perceptions, environmental impacts. Then I will go more into specific studies we have done in Stockholm, Sweden, looking into how far people are willing to walk to access an e-scooter, effects and opinions of parking regulation of e-scooters. And finally, we've looked into whether e-scooters are used as a last-minute mode when people are in a hurry. I will come back to that at the end. So beginning with this literature review, we search for both scientific literature as well as the gray literature like project and evaluation reports and summarize the findings. When it comes to usage and travel behavior, we see that typical e-scooter trips are in terms of length, somewhere in between normal walking and cycling trips. They tend to be used to some extent for work trips, but also to a large extent for social trips, fun, recreational trips, shopping and other errands, which is a bit different from like the typical public transport use, for example. It's fairly common to use them with low frequency. So most users don't use them every day, but maybe one or a few times per week, or one or a few times per month, or even more rare. The demand profiles across the day are also a little bit different from what we normally see in public transport and private cars. So the afternoon peak hour tends to be higher than the morning peak hour, and in fact, more trips are sometimes done during the weekends compared to work days. When it comes to environmental impacts, it has been debated a lot whether they are a positive or negative contribution from a climate perspective. And there are a couple of studies that have looked into that. They are by now a few years old. So, but they looked into the life cycle perspective of e-scooters. What is the climate impact, including manufacturing, the actual use, and also the scrapping of them. And then these studies find that it was kind of break even or doubtful whether they had actually a positive impact. But we see that now the lifespan of the e-scooters are steadily going up. They are not as they don't break as quickly as they used to when they were new. The newer models are more robust, which also means that the life cycle emissions go down. So by now we think that they are actually more climate friendly than the modes that they replace. There are one of the reasons why there is some controversy around these scooters is about how they are being driven and how they are being parked by the users. So there are complaints about that people drive where they are not supposed to, on sidewalks and so on, and also that they are parked in bad spots, for example, just on the sidewalks, blocking the pedestrians. But the studies we saw actually found that most of these scooters were correctly parked. So it seems that there is an impression that is worse than what the studies actually show. And it might be partly an aesthetic and a visual problem. It's also that an incorrectly parked e-scooter might be there for a longer time than, let's say, a taxi or distribution van that parks incorrectly for a shorter duration. But we also looked into different ways that the e-scooter services have been regulated in different parts of the world. So it is fairly common that cities and authorities work with fleet dimensioning, that they put a cap on how many e-scooters are allowed within a city or an area, which can be done through procurement processes or in other ways. Sometimes these are dynamic. So if the scooters are used heavily, they can allow a larger fleet. But if they're not used as much, the allowed fleet size will go down. There are other types of regulations regarding, for example, certain areas that are forbidden to enter with e-scooters. There can be speed limits in some areas where you're not allowed to park, or only certain areas where you are allowed to park. This can be controlled with geofencing techniques. Some city parks also work with equity programs, for example, that forces operators to we put e-scooters in certain areas in order to be allowed to put them in other more profitable areas. Moving on to our own analysis based on data in Stockholm. Actually, Stockholm was one of the earliest cities to receive e-scooters, not far away, far after the first cities in the US. We have looked into users' walking distance to share these scooters. So how far are people willing to walk to access an e-scooters? This is important to understand just to get a sense of people's travel behavior, but also the catchment areas that shared e-scooter services can generate. And especially interested in the context of how can e-scooters be linked to public transport, and what will be the impacts be of parking regulations, parking systems where you limit where the e-scooters are allowed to be located. So we used data from one of the e-scooter operators in Stockholm, Voi. We got data from their app system, so we can see where the user was when they opened the app, and also where the trip actually started and where it ended. And then we can compute the walking distance based on the location of where the app was opened and the location of the trip start, using a combination of as the crow fly distance and Google Maps API distances and some filtering. And we found that most walking trips are quite short. People tend to walk fairly short on average to an e-scooter, a bit longer in the outskirts of the city and shorter in the more central parts. The distances were shorter in the morning hours and during lunch hours compared to afternoon and evening, which is pretty interesting. It can be a preference for the users, but it also might have to do with how the scooters were distributed in the morning versus the afternoon. The users also walked shorter distances when they were close to metro stations. So that seems to indicate that in general, the e-scooters tended to be parked closer to public transport stations compared to how they were located across the city in general. So there seems to be here a link between the e-scooters and public transport. So moving on, talking about parking regulation. In the first couple of years, there were no regulations on parking in Sweden. But in 2022, it was introduced, these regulations saying that you are not anymore allowed to park the e-scooter anywhere, but you have to park them in these kind of designated parking areas or parking racks, or alternatively in a normal bicycle parking rack. And this was, of course, introduced as a response to a lot of complaints about improperly parked or just thrown away e-scooters lying around on the ground. And this, the improperly parked e-scooters were one of the main reasons for negative attitudes towards the e-scooter services. So we conducted a survey to get a better understanding of what the users think about the needs for parking and the attitudes and wishes. The idea is that the results from this survey can be a basis for guidelines on how to design the parking of shared e-scooters in cities. We looked at a couple of different cities around Sweden, and specifically the 3 largest cities, and they all handled parking regulations in different ways, which makes it pretty interesting to compare them. Stockholm introduced a quite high number of new parking zones for the e-scooters, around 700. You can see on the map here to the top right corner where these parking zones and bikes parking are located. You can see that it's a quite dense supply of parking opportunities in Stockholm. Malmö only had about 100 dedicated parking spaces, and on the map in the middle of to the right, you can see that it's much less dense distribution of parking opportunities. And Gothenburg actually didn't impose any parking regulations, so there was no difference here before and after September 2022 when the other cities introduced parking regulation. So we handed out a survey. We took the help of the operator Voi to distribute a sample among their users, and we targeted users who had made at least one trip before September 1st when the parking regulation was introduced, and at least one trip after. So it was sent out to quite a large number of users in each city. We got in percentage quite low response rate, but in absolute numbers quite good number of responses in the end, at least from Stockholm. In terms of demographics and socioeconomic characteristics, we found that the users, the majority of users are men. This is in line what previous studies have also found. But we found that the users in Sweden tended to be a bit older than what we normally see in the literature. So almost half in Stockholm and Gothenburg were more than 40 years old. And in general, quite high income people compared to the overall population as well. Most of them being full-time employees, which is a little bit different from the perception that it's mostly young students, for example, using e-scooters. So we asked them a lot of questions about how they felt it was easy to find parking after the regulation, whether it was clear where you can park, if it was simple to find parking through the app, and so on. We found that the users in Stockholm were the most positive about the parking ban. It was appreciated that the orderliness in the urban environment had improved. But many users found that access and possibility to park near destinations and public transport had become worse after the introduction of the parking regulations. And we looked into the factors behind these attitudes. And it turned out that we didn't find any significant impact of age, gender, education, occupation, etc. The socioeconomic characteristics of the users don't seem to play a big role. It was more the perceptions of the users, whether they felt it was important that there is a high density of parking, and that the parking locations were properly placed. Those type of factors tended to influence the overall attitudes the most. We also found that people who used e-scooters in connection with public transport were among the more negative to the introduction of the parking regulations. They seemed to find that it was now more difficult to make a combined trip with e-scooter and public transport, since you could not park the e-scooter directly in connection to the public transport stop, but you had to find the nearest parking location, which adds some extra time to the transfer, which makes it less convenient. When it comes to actual travel behavior, both respondents in Stockholm and Malmö said that they travel less frequently after the introduction of the parking regulations. They also report that their travel time has been affected, that they have to travel longer now, and that they have to walk a bit further to travel by electric scooters. It's interesting also, coming back to this link between e-scooters and public transport, we asked a few questions in particular about that, regarding who combines shared e-scooters with public transport in a multimodal trip chain. And actually, more than half of the respondents in all cities said that they had combined e-scooter and public transport in the same trip. And we found that it's primarily users with lower incomes or residing outside the city center that were more likely to have made a combined trip. So this is also a bit of a new insight compared to the literature. Actually, these people who live outside the operating area of the e-scooters have not been studied so much before, but we see that people living in the suburbs, for example, which might have a lower socioeconomic characteristics, can use public transport to travel into the central city, and then use e-scooters for the last mile of their trip. So to conclude our findings from this survey, we found that the users in Stockholm seem to be more satisfied than those in Malmö about the parking regulation. And we think that has to do with that Stockholm offered much more places where you could park the e-scooter compared to Malmö. And the density and the location of the parking seems to be the most important aspects from a user perspective when it comes to attitudes and behavior. And we think that if you want to encourage multimodal travel that combines public transport and micromobility, that requires that the parking opportunities are good next to the public transport stops, but also that you can reach your destination and park your e-scooter close to your actual destination. So yes, one thing is to have good parking close to public transport, but also we need this density in the other parts of the city to make this opportunity to use the e-scooter as a first or last mile to public transport a convenient choice. Okay. Finally, I will talk a little bit about our study that looks at e-scooters as a potential last-minute mode. And this was something we caught from the free text responses in our survey. We noted that many respondents commented that they often use e-scooters when they were in a hurry. These are some examples of quotes from respondents in the survey. Some of them complained that with the parking regulation, it was more difficult to use the e-scooter when you are in a hurry because you needed to walk longer to reach an e-scooter compared to before. But nevertheless, we wanted to look more into this this property of e-scooter trips and see if we can find any empirical evidence apart from this more anecdotal evidence that people actually use e-scooters in this way. And we found some evidence from previous studies and reports, some of them also pointing to this fact that users might use them when they are in a hurry. There was one study in Norway that looked at which minute of the hour that e-scooter trips are made and found that there was a peak in the later minutes of the hour, which seems to suggest that if you have a meeting, maybe that starts at the full hour, you might take an e-scooter to get there on time instead of walking or getting there in some other way. So there seems to be some indications that the e-scooters are actually used in this way. And we explored this a bit more in Stockholm. We used 2 different data sets with different advantages. We looked at the trip frequency and the duration and the speed of the trips, and we looked at the time of departure and the arrival of each trip. And question is, how do we measure whether shared e-scooters are used when there's a risk of being late? We need to know something about the preferred arrival time of the traveler, which is in general difficult to know. We cannot really observe the preferred arrival time. But we can identify a case study where we can actually make a plausible guess about the preferred arrival time. As I said, we can reasonably say that many meetings or office hours start at the full hour, like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, etc. But one area where this is extra strict is actually a university campus like KTH, where we have classes that start at 8:15 or 10:15. During normal teaching weeks, classes start 1/4 on every hour. On the other hand, when there are exams in certain weeks, they start sharp on the hour. So if we see a difference here between the normal teaching weeks and exam weeks in terms of when people arrive with these scooters to campus, then we can actually say something that people adapt their travel to when they prefer to arrive on campus. KTH campus is also suitable for this type of study since there are no other modes of transport on the campus. There is a metro and bus terminal in the south corner of the campus, but if you want to reach a classroom anywhere else on campus, you either have to walk or take an e-scooter. So we looked at the distribution of arrival times of e-scooter trips across the day. And at the top here are trips that arrive to campus. Top left are exam weeks, and top right are normal study weeks. And we can see a really clear difference. On exam weeks, there's a big peak just before 8 o'clock, where a lot of the exams start. Whereas on normal study weeks, we see different peaks, one a bit before 8, one bit before 10, one around 13, 1 p.m., and so on. So there are clearly different arrival patterns here. At the bottom, we just plot the same distributions for the city outside the campus, and then we see the pattern is very similar for both types of weeks. We see a peak in the morning and then, a distribution around the midday and afternoon. So if we do like in Norway, we plot which minute of the hour that the trips arrive on the KTH campus. At the top left, it's the exam period. We don't see any real pattern here. Trip seems to arrive quite uniformly. But on the top right, we see the peak appearing just before the 15-minute mark. That's where the classes start. So we see a clear pattern here that e-scooter trips arrive just before the classes start. So maybe when there's an exam, you are more careful not to be late. But if there's just a normal class, then you are not as careful. You can arrive just 1 or 2 minutes before the class starts. In the city overall, on the bottom, in the bottom row, we see a bit a pattern that there are more trips that arrive a bit before the full hour, and also a smaller peak just before the half hour, which is similar to what they found in Norway. And this pattern becomes stronger if we look at, for example, the speed of the trips. So if you're in a hurry, you would expect that you drive faster than if you're not in a hurry. So we looked at the average speed of each trip, of each e-scooter trip to campus, and plotted that for each minute of the hour. This is the one shown at the bottom right here. And we can see that the speed goes up from around minute 45 up to minute 60. And in fact, even a bit, the first few minutes of the hour, the speed is actually the highest. So we think this is pretty good evidence that people speed up, so they are in a more hurry to arrive on time when they are either just a bit before the hour or when they're actually already a bit late. There also actually seems to be a link between last minute trips and last mile trips, because we looked at the share of trips ending at public transport, near public transport stops. And we found that the share of those trips goes down close to the full hour, whereas the share of trips starting near public transport goes up at the full hour. So it could mean that you use public transport. It might be a delay in public transport. So you realize you will not get to your destination on time if you walk as you normally do. So you take an e-scooter instead for that last mile trip to make sure that you are on time. So we think this analysis put a bit more nuance to this debate of whether e-scooters are competitive or complementary to public transport. It might be actually that they, even though they might be competitive in space, they can actually be complementary in time. E-scooters can be used at certain times where it's not a good idea to use public transport. So to summarize, I've quickly gone through a lot of different studies that capture different aspects of the shared e-scooter services. But they are gaining popularity, and parking systems are gaining popularity, and they require some strategic planning for figuring out how to balance accessibility for the users, but also for the general public, so that the scooters don't block the walk paths for pedestrians, for example. Access distance and catchment areas are important factors. If we can have short walking distance near public transport hubs, that will encourage multimodal travel. And we think that they are most effective when they are placed near public transport hubs. We see evidence that they can serve both these last mile travel needs as well as these last minute needs around preferred arrival times. They can substitute walking if you are in a hurry, and they can connect public transport segments. So one use case can be to add some extra flexibility when there are disruptions in public transport, for example. We think that better integration of the two services can both boost the appeal and the reliability of public transport. And finally, this last minute mode study, I think, introduces a temporal dimension to this debate of whether e-scooters are a complement or competition to public transport. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions you might have. Thank you.